Welcome again, everybody, to our webinar on the 15 insights of the global steel transformation. We are quite excited to have this event going, since for our Agora think tanks, it's the first time we address a global problem, a global sector. This is, for the time being, very exciting to discuss the sectors forthcoming, since we all know that a lot of things are going on in the steel sector. My name is Frank Peter. I'm the director of Agora Industry, and I will guide you through this webinar. We have structured the webinar as follows. We will start with a short introduction of Kati about the sector of the status quo. We will have the presentation of our main study results by Wido Witecka and Professor Stefan Lechtenböhmer. We will have thereafter reactions by science and civil society, a short panel discussion to get you also involved in the discussion. So we will start right away to save time with the introduction from Kati. So Kati, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Frank, and good afternoon, good morning to everyone, and also good evening if I saw the Mentimeter right. Thank you for joining our webinar today. It's my great pleasure to introduce today's topic a bit before my colleagues and our panel go into much more detail. What we will discuss today is the steel transformation on a global level. And steel as a basic material is used in numerous industries, applications, and we still see that its demand is rising globally, especially when we look at emerging economies. At the same time, the steel industry is one of the sectors with the highest CO2 emissions. And if this rising demand is met by conventional, which mainly means coal-based steelmaking, any target of staying on a 1.5 degree compatible pathway will be quite impossible to meet for the sector. However, that also implies a huge chance for the steel industry for it to play a role in actually advancing climate ambition. Frank hinted a bit that previously Agora's work on the transformation of industry and also on steel focused mainly on Germany and Europe. What we've seen is that technical solutions for low carbon steelmaking are available. They are ready to be deployed. And at the same time, many steel companies have already announced to build low carbon steelmaking capacities. However, steel is produced globally and it's also traded in global supply chains, which means there's a strong need to address the transformation of the sector also on a global level, especially since more than 2/3 of existing blast furnaces will be reinvested in before 2030. So therefore, our new study on the steel transformation takes such a global view and tackles different potentials across different regions. In the past, the steel sector has often been labeled as hard to abate. Our findings demonstrate that instead it has the potential to become fast to abate and could potentially also be net zero much earlier than anticipated. For that to happen, we urgently need some key elements to be in place to really get into an implementation mode, to apply and install these technical solutions and also additional strategies, for example, on material efficiency. But just as much, we need targeted regulation and enhanced international cooperation so that we can ensure all upcoming investments actually contribute to climate neutrality instead of contradicting it. You will hear a lot more on the details in the next almost 2 hours. I will leave it at that and instead wish you many new insights and an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Kati, thank you very much for this brief and sound introduction. We will indeed hear much more on the details of work that has guided us over the last 2 years almost, I would say. And I would like to hand over now to the main authors of the study you have in front of you. Please welcome at first Wido Witecka, our, I would say, steel guru at this time, who has led most of the work, and he will be presenting the first part of the study, plus Professor Stefan Lechtenböhmer from Wuppertal Institute, who also is a long expert and a long-time colleague to work with us on the industry decarbonization topics. We're happy that both are available to introduce you to the content. Then Wido, Stefan, the floor is yours. Get going.
Yes, thank you very much. 15 insights on the global steel transformation, the work of 2 years, and I am very happy to be here today and to be in the role to present you some of the insights on the global steel transformation. The key finding from our report is that a net zero steel sector by the early 2040s is technically feasible. You see on the left-hand side 3 scenarios. One is a baseline scenario from the Mission Possible partnership, and then our 2 model scenarios, the technology mix scenario and the global green iron scenario, where net zero is achieved by 2044 or even 2040 respectively. On the right-hand side, you see some of the key metrics of our scenarios. There are 2 things that I want to highlight here. The first one is we foresee a strong role for DRI-based steelmaking as a flexible technology for different feedstocks. And the second thing that is also quite new is that we foresee a role for the steel sector to potentially contribute to negative emissions via bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. We will hear more about this later in the presentation. Now, overall, the global steel industry can turn from a hard-to-abate to a fast-to-abate sector. Why is that? Steel can be fast-to-abate because when it comes to technology, important key technologies to start the transition are available now. We are seeing the first final investment decisions, and we also know the key strategies and further promising technologies to get to net zero. When it comes to cost, while it's true that green steel can cost between 30 to 60% more than conventional steel, in most end products, the cost increase is only 1 to 2%. So when you look at the car or when you look at household appliances, smart policies can address the issue of cost. Another element is that the steel sector has actually one of the largest CO2 reduction levers per unit of zero carbon electricity. This is because the fuel switch in the steel sector is either from coal to electricity in the case of secondary steel making, or from coal to renewable hydrogen. And the CO2 reduction potential is greater than in many other sectors per unit of zero carbon electricity. And finally, combining all of this, our study shows that if the full acceleration potential is realized, a net zero steel sector by the early 2040s is technically feasible. Now, when the steel sector moves from a hard-to-abate sector that could potentially be a fast-to-abate sector, this is also important for global climate ambition. And in fact, the steel sector can be a key element to increase climate ambition. On the left-hand side, you see the current view of the IEA with stated policies, IEA steps. We're currently on track for 2.5 degrees global warming by 2100. If all net zero pledges by governments and companies are met, this is the announced pledges scenario. The IEA states that we are on track for 1.7 degrees of global warming by 2100, and for a 1.5 compatible net zero emissions pathway, we would even have to have more ambitious climate targets. You see the ambition gap. When we turn to the right side and look at this picture for the iron and steel sector, you basically see similar scenarios from the IEA, which are the dotted lines. And then compared to that, our scenarios, which show that in an ideal case, there's even acceleration potential to be faster than the IEA net zero emission scenario. So what are the key levers enabling a 1.5 degrees compatible steel decarbonization? The first one is material efficiency. You see on the left-hand side, the baseline scenario from MPP, and then in our scenarios that steel production is around 16% lower by 2050, while providing the same services to the economy. That's the role of material efficiency. You also see a significant increase of scrap-based steelmaking here in gray. And when it comes to primary steelmaking, decarbonizing primary steel, the largest share is done by hydrogen-based steelmaking in light blue here, but we also foresee a role for bioenergy and CCS. And the light green bit is direct electrification technologies. In our view, they have game changer potential. We foresaw a moderate role in this scenario because we didn't want to rely too much on this, but this is another promising technology family on the horizon. Another of the key insights is that in our study, we show that a phase out of coal in steelmaking by the early 2040s is technically feasible. And three factors are important when it comes to a phase out of coal in steelmaking. The first one is we need a swift rollout of clean steelmaking technologies. Otherwise, this will not be possible. A second element is the economic feasibility. Stefan, in his presentation, will talk about the investment cycles of coal-based steelmaking assets and what this means for a coal phase-out narrative. And then finally, so far, in all other steel decarbonization scenarios, there's a role for CCS on the coal-based blast furnace route. We see that skeptical. We think it may be a dead-end road, and Stefan will talk more about the details of that later on. Another important element is that CCS-based technologies with fossil fuels leave comparatively high residual emissions, whereas electricity and hydrogen-based steelmaking routes allow to reduce them to almost zero. You see that in the figure here, that on the right-hand side, CCS-based technologies with fossil fuels have comparatively high direct emissions, but also on top of that, upstream emissions, for example, from coal mine methane leakage or methane leakage associated with natural gas. The key takeaway here is that the steel industry has the technical solutions to reduce residual emissions to almost zero. Now we move into a different space, which is the new topic of green iron trade. International green iron trade can lower the costs of the global steel transformation. As the steel industry moves from coal-based steelmaking to hydrogen-based steelmaking, the cost of low-carbon hydrogen will have a major impact on the competitiveness of steelmakers. So for steelmakers in countries with comparatively high renewable hydrogen costs, this bears the question, how can they ensure their long-run competitiveness? And over the last years, we saw the emergence of a narrative that hydrogen could be traded globally. But when we looked into this, the answer is actually it really depends how the hydrogen is transported. So for steelmakers that eye hydrogen imports, we looked at three different options. The first one was pipeline import. And you see here, that's the bar from the second bar from the right-hand side. The share of the transport cost in dark green is actually comparatively small. So this could be a very interesting and competitive option. The second case is importing hydrogen from overseas by ship. And here you see that the costs for transport are incredibly high. This is because of energy and conversion losses along the transport value chain of hydrogen by ship. And in fact, because of this, it's possible that this may never be a competitive option for the steel industry. A much overlooked option in this regard is to transport green iron by ship. Here, the idea is that cheap renewable hydrogen and iron ore are combined. The iron making step is done in an exporting country, and then basically green iron has roughly comparable properties to iron ore, so it doesn't have the energy and the conversion losses when you transport it by ship, which basically means that the world's cheapest renewable hydrogen costs could be directly transferable to importing countries. Now, what does all of this mean? The good news is that international green iron trade can be a win-win solution for both exporters and importers. For exporters, the case is pretty straightforward. Compared to a scenario where they export iron ore and hydrogen, if they also do the additional step of green iron making in their countries, this will lead to local job gains and local value added. For green iron importers, it's also a good news because this is an option that allows to reduce the steel production costs because of the lower input costs, and therefore helps to ensure competitiveness in steelmaking. And as we see when we look at the jobs, while it is true that the iron making would move overseas and have an impact on jobs, the vast majority of jobs in the steel industry lies in steelmaking and steel finishing, and these jobs could actually be safeguarded by cheap input materials. So this is also a solution that can help those countries to stay competitive in hydrogen-based steelmaking. Now, what does this mean for countries that have comparatively higher hydrogen costs? Should they build out DRI plants or import green iron? We are of the view that they should do both. There are good arguments for building out domestic DRI capacity, strategic autonomy reasons, technology innovation. We're currently seeing the first generation of DRI plants deployed. There's a lot of room for optimization, but also this should be complemented by green iron imports, which can help for cost efficiency and thereby ensure a greater competitiveness. Another important thing is that green iron trade will not establish itself, but we think that cross-country strategic partnerships are needed, where, for example, potential green iron exporting countries and green iron importers try to find solutions where they have an equal partnership. So what could that be? For green iron importers, it could be de-risking policies for renewables, joint technology development, access to climate finance. And for importers, it will be important that there are fair import prices for green iron, because it is possible that there will only be a handful of green iron exporters and there is a risk of market power. Now to the next topic. When you ask the question, why is it possible in our scenario to be faster than most other 1.5 compatible steel decarbonization scenarios, it is because we foresee a faster rollout of DRI technology. You can see here the Mission Possible carbon cost scenario and their deployment rates for DRI technology. They have more before 2030. We think a ramp up is necessary until then. But after 2030, we have significantly higher annual deployment rates of DRI technology. In our technology mix scenario, the manufacturing and deployment capacity is increased by a factor of 10 compared to today. And in the global green iron scenario, even 20%. Now, the key question is this technically feasible? And we looked into examples, and actually in the steel industry, we have seen such deployment rates already in the early 2000s. China, in 1 year, in 2004, built 140 million tons of coal-based blast furnace capacity. DRI plants are not necessarily more complex in design and construction than BF-BOF plants. So we do think that this is possible, but it would really require a focus on this key technology and building up the supply chain. My last insight before I hand over to Stefan: the steel sector can contribute to negative emissions via bioenergy, carbon capture, and storage. Why are we talking about this? Virtually all IPCC scenarios show that some carbon dioxide removal will be required for 1.5 degrees compatible scenarios. The steel sector is one of the sectors that could help to provide them. You see it on the right-hand side, the green area, which is like the negative emissions over time in our technology mix scenario. How does this work? Biomass absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere during its growth phase. And if it's then used in the steel industry and combined with CCS, then overall this can generate negative emissions. However, there are a lot of complex topics, and I just want to give a brief overview about the trade-offs and topics that we need to discuss. The first one is sustainable biomass will be limited. We need to reverse the trend of biodiversity loss. We have a growing world population. This will put stress on land. But it's all the more important then that we prioritize the use of biomass. There are many principles that are out there regarding biomass prioritization. I want to mention one that I think is a new one, which is that there's a trade-off between negative emissions or biomass that can contribute to negative emissions and biomass that contributes to net zero emissions. Let me explain this by one example. Today, a lot of biomass is used in road transport or in building heat. And for both of these sectors, we have direct electrification options to also reach net zero in those sectors. We also understand that if biomass is used in those sectors, you cannot do CCS in those sectors. So the potential of this biomass to generate negative emissions is basically lost. What if we could free up some biomass from those sectors and put it into various applications, industry sectors such as chemicals, such as cement, such as steel, to generate negative emissions? That's one of the things that we need to discuss. As two key takeaways from this topic, the first one is BECCS is an incredibly complex topic. This can only be the starting point of the discussion, not the end. And we will need to discuss some of the trade-offs. We will need to learn more and see what the outcome will be. The second key message is, because this is such a complex topic, we need to make sure that we eliminate the residual emissions that can be eliminated technically, because otherwise you run into exactly these kind of discussions. And in most steel scenarios today, there's a large share of residual emissions by 2050. And then the problem is basically in other sectors actually have to deal with the negative emissions. So this is not a good solution, and that's why we need to talk about this topic and also bring it to the attention of the steel industry. I hand over to you, Stefan.
Thank you, Wido. And let's just start with the next slide. Before I add some further messages to what Wido already said, again, thank you from my side for being invited here, and also to my colleagues, Alexander Jülich and Clemens Schneider, who did much of the work on that. I start with insight number 9, and that's again on the role that CCS will play, but here on the conventional blast furnace road with coal. And we cannot see that it will be really playing an important role, which is another argument for coal phase out. On the left side, you see the announcement for direct reduced iron projects. And on the right side, in comparison, CCS. And we see that hardly any plans for CCS are currently there, as opposed to the direct reduced iron. So steel industry, at least at the moment, seems not to really love the solution. And we think that's due to mainly 4 reasons. First, CCS leaves high residual emissions. Wido already mentioned that. it will also be prone to disruptive technology developments by competing technologies. So this is a technology that really locks in costs and may become uncompetitive in the future. We will also have no chance to really address upstream emissions from coal mining, for example, which are partly pretty high and which can become an additional business risk if they are included into regulation. And steel industry has to tackle them. And last point, CCS plants on coal also face an offtake risk in green need markets because we do not really know today whether those markets will accept this sort of light green or steel. So that's really probably those issues why steel industry is hesitating to announce projects in CCS. So after this announcement, let me go into two issues, two insights that show that a rapid coal phase out in steel may also make sense economically. First insight is on existing blast furnace steel making plants. And we foresee in the scenarios that Wido already presented that by 2040, over 90% of existing blast furnaces can be phased out without a premature shutdown. So how will that work? We see, Kati already mentioned that over 70% of existing blast furnace capacity, so more than 1 billion tons of annual production capacity, will be phased out before 2030. So there's really a strong pressure on industry. And even as a significant part of that will be overcapacity, for example, in China and other markets, so need not be replaced by conventional technology. And also, we think we will see almost 180 million tons of scrap-based steelmaking capacity coming online, replacing parts of those technology. There's still a large share of that 1 billion tons of steelmaking capacity that need to be replaced. And we think by 2030, we will see roughly 100 million tons of capacity to be replaced by hydrogen-based DRI technology. The rest of it, so roughly 60% of the blast furnace capacity to be relined or reinvested in this decade, will be reinvested as conventional blast furnaces. So that could, of course, be a danger of a significant carbon lock-in. But we think if these capacities are reinvested for short times of on average 13 years only, that those will be then reinvested by DRI technology in the coming decade. So basically in the 2030s and early 2040s. And this can avoid carbon lock-in. The next slide gives you some reasons why we think that this is feasible. Conventional wisdom often assumes that a relined blast furnace stays in operation for roughly 25 years. However, if you look into empirical results, it seems to be much shorter, particularly the following campaigns of the blast furnaces, which are not the first one, tend to be much shorter than these 25 years. On average, we see in the literature some 13 years, and that's what we used. And on top of this, there tends also be a cost benefit of shorter relining periods, which can be also attractive. So we see that the fast defossilization of existing blast furnace technology will be in the best interests of the industry as well, and can be really aligned in a way that we do not necessarily have early close downs of existing producing assets. And that's an interesting results of our analysis and of the scenario. However, there remains one issue that is a bit more tricky, and that's in India and Southeast Asia. Wido, can you go to the next slide. Yes, thank you. On top of this huge existing blast furnace capacity or blast furnace fleet, which is about 1,500 million tons of production capacity a year, we see currently plans to build new greenfield blast furnaces in emerging economies, particularly in India, other Asian countries, and China. In total, more than 300 megatons of steelmaking capacity. And of course, investing in this technology, in these new greenfield assets with the conventional coal-based technology would lead to a significant and massive carbon lock-in. And we can see on the right side that these assets will be in operation economically long beyond the climate mitigation and net zero targets of many countries. And even in India, which so far has only a target for 2070, parts of these assets will be in operation still. However, some of the Indian steelmaking companies already have set themselves more ambitious targets to become climate neutral by 2050. So here in these countries, there will also be a strong risk of carbon lock-in. However, that needs not be like that. Can you go to the next slide? Next slide shows that for this investment, it's not really an issue when we want to replace them by hydrogen-based DRI technology on the CapEx side. The left display shows that CapEx of a DRI plant on the green field is even slightly lower than that of a conventional coal-based plant. So CapEx needs would be almost similar if all these projects, these greenfield projects, would be switched to green hydrogen-based ones. However, on the right side, we can see the real challenge, and this is that the OPEX, mainly due to the hydrogen costs, will be between 30 and 60% higher than that of the conventional coal-based route. And this is, of course, an issue that we need to tackle, that the governments need to tackle. Probably we need strong international cooperation to enable those countries, particularly those Southeast Asian developing countries, to not run into lock-ins in an old carbon-based technology, but instead go to, as everybody else, go to good and new technology. To sum it up, both of these displays show that a switch to hydrogen-based technology can be in the best interest also of economy. After this, we go to a couple of potential bottlenecks that we can have. First one is low carbon hydrogen supply. We all know that a huge amount of low carbon hydrogen is crucial for steel decarbonization. And the pipeline of, luckily, the pipeline of green hydrogen projects is rather big. However, the pipeline of demand sectors is even bigger. On the left side, we see the IEA net zero emission scenario again, and we see that the potential demand by diverse sectors is much bigger than the current 2030 pipeline for low carbon hydrogen supply in all sectors. However, if we compare it to the right side, the low carbon demand by the steel sector, which is estimated in our scenario by 2030 to be about 5 million tons, that's only some 13% of the current low carbon hydrogen pipeline. So that's relatively low and potentially feasible. It's particularly feasible if we concentrate hydrogen to those sectors that are really, really no regret hydrogen applications. And we can see in this display that when using green hydrogen based on renewable electricity in the steel sector with 1 kilowatt hour of green electricity, we can reduce 550 grams of CO2 in steelmaking. As compared to this, when using the hydrogen to power a former diesel car, we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by roughly half of this, 280 grams. If we put it into buildings or power generation, it's even much lower. And what is more, in those sectors, we can use the electricity directly without converting it to hydrogen, and then we will achieve much higher greenhouse gas emission reductions. So electrification in those sectors where it's potential and prioritizing hydrogen for those sectors where it's not easily possible and where it has the highest greenhouse gas impact is a very good strategy. And then we will see that we most probably will have enough green hydrogen for the sector. I come to another bottleneck, and this is the availability of DR grade ore. For the hydrogen-based direct reduction route, we need high quality ore of rather high ore contents of more than 2/3. And this ore is particularly rare today. And so that may be really an issue to have enough of the ore available for the strong ramp up of this route. However, there are also a couple of solutions to that. The first one is, of course, to develop more mining projects into ore resources with higher ore content. Another route is to beneficate existing ore qualities to higher iron contents. And the last one is to stronger go to the direct reduction smelt BOF route, which is currently been announced already, and is even the investment decision has been taken by ThyssenKrupp in Germany, because this route can work with a slightly lower grade ores as well, and there the supply is much bigger. So these are three strategies where we can overcome this iron ore bottleneck. To sum up, there are a couple of bottlenecks for fast steel decarbonization, but they are manageable if we go for joint action from governments and industry together. We have given it a sort of a traffic light signal, and we see the announcement of H2 ready DRI cumulative is not really in line with what we need, but the pipeline for 2030 is already quite promising, with 55% of what we may need. If we then go into final investment decisions for DRI, there still a lot of thing has to happen, and not that much investment decisions have really been taken. We hope that we will see a lot in the near future. Wido has extensively presented the DRI construction capacity. We believe that it can be ramped up, but so far the current status is by far not enough, and also the pipeline visible for 2030 is still pretty small as compared what we need in production capacity. Green is more or less the low carbon hydrogen announcement, and I already talked about that. Final investment decisions in these fields, however, need to be massively ramped up, but that's a political field that is also tackled by many other streams. And last but not least, as just mentioned, the additional DR grade pellets that we need. And here there is a pipeline. We see about 1/3 of what's needed is in the pipeline for 2030. But again, here also strong action by industry and governments is needed. With this, I give you one more example. That's the share of final investment decisions for near zero emission capable steel making. And so we think we need for 2030 between 120 and 150 million tons of net zero steel making capacity. So far, we see investment decisions for 2030, final investment decisions of some 18 megatons, which is roughly 15% of what we will need. However, announcements are much bigger, already at least in the dimension of what we need. So we hope that these announcements will materialize soon into final investment decisions, and also further announcement investment decisions add on it. But still a way to go. Finally, to really achieve that, we need targeted policy mixes by governments, which are combined from upstream measures, which provide for clean energy and raw materials infrastructure, as well as midstream investments. We have talked a lot about these today, in climate-friendly production processes, in the DRI technology. And of course, we also need the downstream climate-friendly end products, create the green markets, create the instruments for green markets, and of course also circularity, take care that an increasing share of scrap-based steel can be really brought online. So we really need in every constituency, in every state, such an integrated policy framework. And what we also need is strong international coordination and cooperation, and probably also support of developing countries. And while on the downstream, there's already some very promising international action, for example, by the IEA, by the G7 and other international groups. We are introducing green steel benchmarking, etc. So, and there's already biased coalitions of green markets. And there is also a couple of activities on the upstream side, particularly regarding green hydrogen. But what we really are lacking is the midstream field. So that is investment into green steelmaking capacities, investment or activity to ramp up the production capacity for these mills. And that's where I think it's also very important to see more government action also internationally. So with this, thanks a lot. We are happy to provide you some of our first results, and let's make green steel happen fast.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, Wido. So as we have now experienced, everyone who might have thought with the first insight that a climate neutral steel sector in the mid of the 2040s is somewhat possible, who have may have thought the job is done, that's not the case. We are quite at the beginning of a journey that holds lots of challenges, that we need to go deeply into it. And I'm happy that we discuss now some of the challenges with our experts of the scene that we have invited to join us and give us some more insights. I would like to start with Margaret. Margaret Hansbrough has served as a campaigner advisor and consultant, specializing in industry decarbonization. She served with the government of the United Kingdom in the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy as a senior policy advisor for the COP26. So she really comes from the inside and has also quite experienced how those challenges we have been picturing here are taken up from governments, from policymakers to address these. And I hope, Margaret, you can share some thoughts with us, what you think of our study, of the results, and about the perspective of the sector. Margaret, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Thank you, Frank, and thank you, Wido and Stefan, for your thorough presentation, and more importantly, for doing this challenging and important work and putting this out into the world. It's a great service to everyone here and obviously to the planet. It's wonderful to be here with you all, with good friends and colleagues who I've been working with the last few years on this important issue of steel decarbonization. As Frank mentioned, So I have a mixed background of both policy and civil society. I am with a new organization now called SteelWatch. We're an emerging organization, and we exist to accelerate the transformation to a decarbonized steel sector. And we're a new civil society organization committed to driving accountability and urgent climate action. And we'll be launching and releasing our first report later this month. So a few reactions. Overall, I mean, this is really one of the, I think, the clearest to date technical analysis, and really makes, the possibilities and the limits crystal clear of what we must and can do when it comes to steel decarbonization. And I think the biggest takeaway for me is that not only must we phase out coal, but we can phase out coal. If you had asked that question 5, even 3 years ago, I think you would have had very different reactions, perhaps from audiences and from listeners. Whereas I think now that is we've gotten to the point where that really is a foregone conclusion, but this analysis makes it crystal clear. At the end of the day, it's not really up for debate. Coal is coal, and the planet does not differentiate between thermal coal or met coal anymore, or ever really did. I also really like the framing of fast to abate. I think that puts a really good positive spin on kind of where we're heading towards with steel. And I would totally agree that when it comes to other industrial sectors, other industries, that the pace of acceleration for steel is moving faster than ever, which is really exciting. But you knew there was a but coming. The reality is we are still not moving fast enough, not at all. Time is of the essence. If we want to get on track for 1.5C trajectory for steel, we have 2,390 days. That's it. 6.5 years. Some of you all with young kids, they'll be barely out of kindergarten or in kindergarten by then. This is going to go fast. And so it's going to require us to take bolder and bigger action than ever before. And it's going to require some really firm lines on fossil fuel use throughout our economy. But I think we're really needing to shift from taking some of the lessons from the power sector and starting to apply them into the industrial sector. And so I'm looking to examples like the Powering Past Coal Alliance for the power sector and things like that, where you really have groups of aligned nations working towards phase outs and sunsets of coal. It will require, as this study points out, a lot of flexibility to reimagine the steel value chain. And I think this analysis really points out the opportunities and the advantages, the potential competitiveness of that reimagining of the value chain, to decouple essentially iron making and steel making, which of course iron making being the biggest driver of emissions. This analysis caps a clear consensus over the last 18 months as well. That's really emerged that CCS or CCUS for blast furnaces just is not a credible solution. 5 years ago, you could maybe evaluate kind of a mix of portfolio solutions, but I think it's very, very clear that it just won't be able to play a significant role at all in reducing emissions, certainly not before 2030, 2035. And as that time passes and these other solutions win out, the business case just totally falls away. Right now, I think it's time for OECD countries to really step up in a big, big, big way. The US, the EU, Japan, South Korea, other major producers. I see South Korea moving faster than Japan right now. Japan really still promoting a lot of solutions that this analysis clearly, I think, discredits. And So I think that really needs to be taken into account, and there needs to be some positive peer pressure within the OECD. I just can't see any credible investor, supporting relighting, let alone a new blast furnace within the OECD, which I think, that latter point, I don't think is being considered, but there are some relinings announced in the US that I think by Cleveland-Cliffs that I think really need to come under severe scrutiny. So again, the climate-based trading arrangements, we talked about that. I think, that needs to manifest in a few different ways, but starting with green iron is a great way to sell the upsides of it to begin with. But there also needs to be clear on-ramps for non-OECD countries or countries who don't have that competitive advantage to be able to make green iron or green steel. And ideally, with technology and investment from OECD and OECD-based companies when needed, that, part of the solution set is not just for the countries who can make this transition, but for OECD and frankly wealthy countries to enable that transition globally and to lead to on-ramps and participation from a diverse set of economies, particularly emerging economies, so that we're not having this kind of bifurcated strategy, which doesn't really lead to net emissions overall. I think that's the last thing that we want. I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Frank.
Thank you very much, Margaret. You mentioned a couple of important topics we will, of course, later address also in a panel discussion. Thanks for that. I would now invite Chris Bataille to the floor. Chris is also a long-standing expert in the field. He has been active in global energy and climate policy analysis for more than a quarter of a century, I have to admit, Chris. So it's time. So that we've been around also together. Chris was, of course, also lead author for the industry chapter of the 6th cycle of the IPCC working group, 3 assessment report. So he is really one of the experts. And also Chris is working himself, I guess, on a global steel report, how this trajectory could look like. And Chris, we are happy to hear from you what your thoughts, what your initial reaction to our findings are. Thanks.
Okay, fabulous, Frank. Well, to start with, I feel old now. Thank you. But first of all, this is an absolutely excellent addition to the whole steel decarbonization debate. It really pushes right to the cutting edge. It makes some really strong claims with lots of good evidence, which is great. But it also provides some points for debate. And I'm going to sort of mix and match through here. So some of the things I'd like to reemphasize and then point to things that I think are going to need some more investigation. The point about iron ore supply, I'm not sure that, this, I'm really glad you guys highlighted it, but I'm not sure that we've completely appreciated how important, where we are with in terms of sufficient iron ore supply, DRI grade iron ore. One of the reasons the hybrid project succeeded as well as it did is it had LKAB as a partner, right? And LKAB is a very sophisticated iron ore process and mining and processing company, and they also sit on one of the world's largest supplies of magnetite. Now, a key distinction with magnetite versus hematite is that it's magnetic, right? And they have means as they to concentrate it up to 67% quite easily, right? And I actually had the opportunity of going through their lab where they assess how they make pellets and test them and all the methods to do that. And it's actually quite an art. It's quite an engineering endeavor to create high quality DRI grade pellets. Now, the problem is, globally, we scraped off the top of all the high quality hematite, and we've left a lot of poor quality hematite. And everyone keeps pointing to the ThyssenKrupp, smelter, post DRI smelter approach. But what that does is it allows you. You still need high concentration ore, but allows you to take all the gauge off. You still need those higher quality pellets to work with. So, the key thing here is, I think, we need to put some thoughtful effort needs to go. Is there a way to concentrate hematite? Can we get more magnetite mines open? There are very large deposits in Australia that are undeveloped. And the thing is, it's like, one of your other conclusions is, we're at roughly 1/7 or 1/20th of the necessary capacity to make DRI furnace shafts. But Midrex and Tenova, with some help from, other industrial, can do that fairly rapidly. Getting iron ore mines opened is a whole social endeavor. It's a whole permitting endeavor that I don't think we've quite appreciated as much. So anyway, I'd just like to reiterate that, this is maybe a bigger blocker on ramping up DRI than we might have figured a year or two ago, but it's not insoluble, but it needs more effort. So there's that one. In terms of getting negative emissions, using sort of biomass-based syngases passing through a DRI reactor, we know it's quite, it's a regular engineering endeavor separating methane into a certain ratio of hydrogen and carbon monoxide, right? I'm not sure that we're at the point now where we can take biomass, gasify it, and separate it into certain ratios of hydrogen and carbon monoxide as we do with methane. Now, again, it's not insoluble, but it's something that needs effort, and it will contribute to this, potentiality to create negative emissions out of the sector. The other thing is being careful about the carbon neutrality. The more the literature builds, the more it looks like having anything to do with cutting down forest may be less than completely carbon neutral and may actually be worse than coal in some situations. Now, that's not necessarily the case with agricultural waste, right? And a specific species with agricultural waste. So we've got to be careful with the carbon neutrality. And I think some effort has to go into the technical aspects of creating really clean and consistent syngases. I want to come back to, I love the whole section on green iron trade, right? And other folks may be aware that we're also doing a study on this, looking at the point-to-point, what the assessment of the costs are. But I love the way you laid it out. I love the way you laid out the value added, how it goes from one to the other. And, and there's a crucial point in there that it may help current steelmakers hang on to their existing high value added, right? Instead of seeing it as the few job losses and reduction as a threat, thinking of it as a way to hang on to that the other 95% of the high value jobs that are attached to making steel and turning the steel into valuable things. So I really like that section. I'm going to close out my comments by focusing on developing country adoption. Yes, you guys have laid out, probably the fastest move to net zero in the steel sector I've seen in a study, which is amazing. But everything in there points to increased costs. Right. And it's increased costs with things that may have tight markets over the coming decades. There'll be tight markets for DR grade pellets, tight markets for DR reactors, what have you. All this is going to add cost. And, if I need steel in India now, if I need steel in Africa now, there is no incentive mechanism for me to choose DRI, hydrogen, and that route or blast furnaces with coal. Right. So I think we're fumbling our way in the OECD towards incentive structures that, as BF-BOFs come up for replacement, they will be replaced with DRI and eventually electrolysis technologies. And I can even see China just making the decision to do it, right? That they won't replace their blast furnaces. But with the huge steel demands coming for India, for transport, for infrastructure, what have you, eventually as parts of Africa the industrial cycle starts to kick off there is nothing in place right now to incentivize them to use the DRI route versus the BF-BOF route. And I think that's the biggest danger that we're facing right now. But anyways, it was a fabulous report. I really enjoyed reading it. It's really clear, really gets to the point. It takes us to some interesting research questions, and I thank you for it.
Chris, thank you very much. Very much appreciated comments and also pointing exactly where the challenges are ahead of us. Now, I want to bring two other people to our panel discussion. We have talked a lot about the steel industry, it's time to get them involved. So I would like to welcome Andrew Purvis to the scene, to the floor. He's Director of Sustainable Manufacturing with the World Steel Association, a dynamic member-led industry association with strong focus on sustainability. And he has worked in and around the steel industry for also lots of decades for now in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Australia. So knows also a lot of the business along the value chain globally. And we are happy to have him on board. And I would also like to invite Stefania Relva from the E+ Institute in Brazil, representing an important voice also of the global south in the discussion of an emerging economy that needs to be heard. Before Stefania joined E+, she worked as a researcher in the Energy and Planning and Sustainability department at the University of Sao Paulo. She has also quite some experience in the history of, or also in the transformation aspects of energy systems, because she has worked on it as an editor in the past, for example, in a book called The Energy Transition in Brazil. And I would now like us to get us going to have a bit more exchange on the topics. Of course, also Margaret and Chris were bringing up in the debate. I would like to start with the first question to Andrew. You have heard a lot about topics of international green iron trade, phase out of coal and steel making, bottlenecks existing to that access, the need for international cooperation, and a lot of, I would say, boundaries or trademarks that are needed to really get a fast action going in the steel sector. What are your main takeaways, if you like, from an industry perspective, at our main findings? I'm very keen to hear about that, Andrew.
Thanks, Frank, and thanks for having me on. I think your report makes very clear that the transition's possible, and I think that it's fundamentally not now a technology issue. There's clearly some development work to do. This is all new and it's largely undemonstrated. So we need to do scaling and deployment work around issues, particularly like hydrogen storage and handling. But I think we increasingly understand the pathways and the technology pathways we're going to need. I think I also agree it would be possible to go further and faster in some regions if the enabling conditions are optimal, and the bottlenecks, as you call them, are removed. And I think we're seeing that in the Nordic region, which Chris kind of touched on, where you've got those enabling conditions really lined up for fast industry scale out and demonstration. You've been clear that your report isn't regional, so I think maybe that regionality isn't part of the discussion today. I think that's going to be important because we're not in an ideal world, and I think the world we live in and the steel industry in it is very heterogeneous in its structure and how we will decarbonize. India's come up, I think, in the discussion a few times. So, the conditions in India, in terms of energy access, demand, market, asset age, policy and targets, they're very different to Europe. And OECD did some interesting work, I think, recently looking at the consequences of this industry heterogeneity. And I think that's an important thing to think about. I'm not as pessimistic on CCS. I think it's very clear that Europe has largely elected to take the hydrogen route, but I think there's still potential for CCS to play a role in places like India and China, where the policies and targets at the moment aren't the same, as Europe. So we might not see those projects in the pipeline, but there's I think, interest. And you raised some important questions, and we have to show that CCS is effective, technically, as a credible mitigation option, I think, as well. And like Chris, I appreciated the commentary on green iron. This is a hot topic. And I think there's a number of operators and new entrants looking at questioning this historical co-location of reduction and processing of steel. It's early days, but we might easily see a structural change in our industry with reduction happening in Australia, Brazil, places rich in ore, and renewables. And I thought the just transition, jobs element brought something that I really hadn't thought about. So thank you for that. And you've identified some critical issues which need to be resolved, which I guess we'll get to that shortly.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for these interesting insights also from an industry perspective. And of course, this makes us also a bit, welcomed, and that the industry itself is really, and also this reflects a bit, that industry, that the sector is dynamic. There's not a big pushback on such an, let's say, dynamic approach to this. And this is, I guess, at the moment, very unique to the steel sector, that there you feel really the dynamics going on, and that the sector is ready to roll and to go, seeking for the right frameworks to go. You have made this distinction already between emerging economies and maybe the OECD countries, G7. And I'm really happy that we have Stefania also with us at the panel to ask this question. Well, how does this look like from an emerging economy perspective? Of course, many of you know that the Brazilian steel sector, with its also charcoal dependency, already has a lot of green steel making also in the processes. But what does this kind of presentation of study holds for you from a representative of the global south, of a country that sits on lots of potential also for this transformation?
First of all, I would like to comment the importance of this study, because when we talk about energy transition, we need to consider the whole value chain, the decarbonization of the whole value chain, integrating the importers and the exporters, and think about this globally. So this is very important. And in the sense, all the insights of these studies are very important from a Brazilian perspective and from an emerging country perspective. But I would like to highlight two in particular, which are closely related to the studies that we have been doing and the projects we have been developing in the Reimann Institute, which are the insights related to the international green iron trade. And this is both in relation to the potential of lower the cost of steel transformation and the win-win situation among importers and exporters. And this is where the issue about being in a emerging country and developing countries can be taken into the consideration. The first point that I want to comment about this is Brazil has an urgent need for a new industrialization process. The country needs to develop a more modern industry and taking even more advantage of the renewable potential, and to create new jobs and to improve social and economic development. So for us, transition is not only about decarbonization. I know this is not only for us, but for the entire world. But when you talk from the developing and emerging countries' perspectives, we also have to think a lot about creating jobs and improving social and economic development. And that being said, Brazil is also one of the biggest exporters of iron ore, and is also among the top 10 steel producers. And we have today the expected green costs is very, very low, ranging from $4 to $6 per kilogram. And new study says that we can reach even $2 per kilogram, which in fact can reduce the price of green iron produced in Brazil for the international markets. Dr. Chris commented about the worry in relation to the consumption of these products, the capability of the developing countries in paying for these green products. And we think that our domestic industry needs to have the demand signalization for these green products. We need to to have this idea to engage the national industry in this process. In fact, this is a win-win situation. If we can produce green iron, we can add value to our industry and create more jobs and get some evolution in social and economic development. But I would also like to emphasize the importance moving towards a fully green industry in Brazil. Thinking about the domestic use of these projects, we at MIS, we are advocating for a green new industrialization process in Brazil, and the production of the green steel is now our biggest focus, thinking about domestic use and also exportations. So that's the overview.
Thanks, Stefania, for this very specific positioning, also for displaying what the roles and the challenges for an opportunity country like Brazil is. Coming back to Margaret, so your organization is working for holding the Paris targets and really staying on the 1.5 compatible pathway. But what does this actually mean? What does this actually mean from your perspective for the steel sector going forward? Is net zero by 2050 equivalent from your perspective to being compatible? What's your perspective on that? If you from your organizational perspective need to see the challenges ahead when looking at the steel decarbonization?
Sure. Great question. I think the growing consensus, in my opinion, and certainly from SteelWatch perspective, 2050 or net zero by 2050 is at this day and age equivalent to greenwashing. A 1.5 aligned pathway with specific benchmarks, I would say every 5 years minimum, is what's needed. So really accounting for what is left essentially of the remaining carbon budget and where we need to get to by 2030. From SteelWatch's perspective, we're really not thinking too much past 2030 at this point. If we can't make significant changes by then, aligning with a 1.5 trajectory for steel, all bets are off. And so that we really are focused on bringing urgency to the steel sector and accountability to the steel sector to meet those targets and goals. And I think that's now more than ever, as we're seeing we're inching day by day closer to the planetary limits. And I think there no excuses. And I think that will be a 1.5 aligned framework really is increasingly becoming the only credible framework, full stop. We're seeing financial institutions and those who kind of set rules of the road or influence them increasingly moving towards that. And so I think while even a few years ago, net zero, seemed like a win, I think, the bar has really, really moved. I think, particularly finance and investors are going to increasingly catch up. I think the good news for steel is that we have a lot of solutions we can deploy right now that can make significant progress to align with the pathway outlined in this report and with a 1.5 trajectory. But it means firm lines on sunset for coal and phase out of coal, and major deployment of new technologies. So I hopefully that answers your question.
Thanks. Yeah, very crystal clear what, from your perspective, the needs are to stay in the range of 1.5, let's put it that way. Chris, we on the research side have quite worked a bit on, let's say, getting the hard-to-abate narrative overall from the industry sector, making clear that we have technology strategy available. If you look at this acceleration potential of the steel sector, you already addressed it a bit in your opening remarks. what is your take on this? Is the steel sector overall in a position to make a significant contribution as a sector, as maybe one of only a few sectors that really can, on the near term, short term, accelerate? What's your overall assessment on this question?
I would say yes. And partly it's because of the human organization and industrial structure of the sector, right? We don't have billions of decision makers. We don't even have millions. We have thousands. We even have a few hundred when it comes to, if we start counting the numbers of the people on the boards of steelmaking companies. And I might extrapolate that to cement and a few other industries. If we can convince them that they can make safe investment decisions in near zero and possibly negative facilities, that there will be a market, someone willing to pay at least the mark, they'll recover their costs on it. I think we can move really, really quickly. And, my hope is that by the early 2030s, that no one's building anything other than near zero emissions plants. And again, it's the number, and these are highly effective decision makers too. You can get to them, and if you can get to them and you can convince them, they will act.
Great, that's a promising outlook. And Andrew, if you hear that also civil society organizations express a lot of hope, let's put it that way, to the sector of steel to contribute to a faster track and to be part of the solution for the climate challenge, for the climate crisis that we have ahead of us. How is this currently discussed within World Steel Association? How are you, or maybe also reevaluating as an organization to react to these kind of new dynamics you feel in the sector over the last couple of years? What is the World Steel Association doing about this? You're still on mute, Andrew.
Sorry, it's only been 2 years. Look, I think there's been a huge change in the way society and the industry looks at this issue compared to where we were, 5-10 years ago, and I'd certainly welcome that. In terms of our role at World Steel, I think it's partly to draw attention to these issues in our discussions with international organizations, representatives of other sectors and our own members, to encourage discussion around development of long-term solutions. And the international approach is absolutely critical. It's pleasing for me that when you talked about your bottlenecks that you picked up, I think there's really strong alignment between the things that you're identifying and the kind of the issues that I find myself talking about as enablers of transition, if you look at that more positively. The coming decade is the decade of action. And probably the ones I worry about the most are the issues that aren't under the direct control of the sector. You pick up skills, right, and engineering capacity. I think that's really important. And it's not just green skills, it's conventional skills, because there's going to be a load of new stuff that's going to be built. And we haven't been investing in, welding and engineering and some of those practical skills so much. You talked a lot about hydrogen supply, and infrastructure, I think more broadly is going to be really important. In the old days, when you're building a steel plant, you didn't need to worry about where you get your coal from. Am I going to be able to get the iron ore? You just build a deep water port and buy it on the market. Well, that's not the case anymore. We need, massive investment to enable the energy and raw materials to be provided. And that's not all going to happen, in the sector. You've talked about raw materials. I think Chris and you guys made some really good points about that. Financing is another really important issue. There's massive investment needed in and around, our sector through this transition, especially around energy and the supply chain. I think policy and market pull helps. Another issue I found myself talking about is regulation. You've got high-level climate policy, which I think everyone understands, but there's also issues around permitting. If this is going to happen quickly, and it needs to happen quickly, that's the whole point of the conversation today, regulators and who can work with steel companies and take risk-based approaches to regulation and permitting is really going to help. Permitting is not glamorous, but it's so important if you're going to enable these first of a type plants to be implemented and built. Not that regulators take silly risks, but just take risks, in the way that we all do. So I recognize your bottlenecks. I raise you a few, and I find myself increasingly, discussing those with policy members, and our members are really having these conversations domestically as well with their customers, their suppliers, and their governments. So I think that will have to continue and will have to accelerate.
Thank you. It always ends up with policymaking, right? Setting the right frameworks in the regions to act, to go forward. This is basically what is needed. And considering this, Stefania, if we turn our head to Brazil, is this kind of potential win-win situation for the country already relevant in the political discourse? You have had this political change again in Brazil happening with Lula being elected again. How has this eventually also turned the environment? And is this opportunity understood and caught in the political arena in Brazil?
Yeah, with the current federal government, we have this federal government has been discussing the sustainable new industrialization for Brazil. This is a key point in the Brazil's current administration agenda, and it has led to better debates on these ideas in the country. So the environment now is better to discuss green economy and sustainable development. Brazil right now has a significant buzz in regards to the hydrogen, and initially very focused on the exportation of green hydrogen. We also have some states publishing developing plans for hydrogen. At federal level, we have a Senate commission currently discussing policies for green hydrogen. But additionally, we also have some entities such the Ministry of Development, Industry, Trade and Services, and the National Bank for Social and Economic Development that are raising the point that we should not solely rely on hydrogen for exportation. These entities are highlighting the need to incorporate the hydrogen in our industry. And steel and iron industry, it's one of the focus. Although this perspective is not yet fully integrated into the Brazilian discussion, we see here still a lot of focus in exporting hydrogen, but we are, at least at MIs and with some government agencies, we are working hard to make it happen, including strengthening the relations with government and industries to develop strategies to steel industry decarbonization in Brazil.
So thanks for this insight. So Chris, once again, more a bit on the technical side. You're doing a lot of also technical research, what is going on in the sector as innovation and so on. We have heard a lot of new direct electric approaches. How would you, from these kind of technical innovation experience, see the current state of play? What kind of technical concepts are there out there? We have heard that CCS itself, we see it a bit critical. Andrew says, hey, it may have a role for also the emerging economies that build a lot of integrated steelworks again eventually today. So what's your assessment on the technology side of things? Are there any eventually new breakthroughs awaiting that we do not foresee from a let's say more ready to market kind of view as we have taken here? What's your guess on that?
That's an excellent question. I think we're going to be surprised by how different things that we already know about get integrated, right? So how ThyssenKrupp, put together a DRI with a submerged arc furnace with their BOF as a fast thing that they could do and not threaten, they just put in that BOF. They've got to continue, they've got a really tight relationship from their steel making through to their customers. They did. And that was interesting how they did that. And I don't think a lot of people expected they were going to do that until they did it. Now, in terms of technologies that could really flip the deck, I think the electrolysis technologies are going to win the day eventually, but the problem is everyone keeps forgetting how long it takes to get from TRL 1, 2, 3 up to 8. Like 8, you start generating revenue because you start, reducing iron or other metals, and then you can ship and you can get that premium that you need and what have you. But there's the whole valley of death, so from TRL 4 up to about TRL 7, where lots of money goes out the door. It starts at millions, it goes to hundreds of millions, and it even gets up into the billions before you're finally generating any. And it takes a long time. Like very few technologies have gone from that really low level to that revenue generating level in less than 20 to 30 years. And I can't really, like, even wind and solar, the miracles that we're seeing right now, those started in the 1970s and early 80s. That's when the first commercial ones were available. And, I think those technologies eventually are going to hit the market, and they're going to hit the market big, and they'll be more efficient and more modular and all those good things, but they're not going to arrive in time to appreciably keep us under 1.5 to 2C. And I think might be difficult for proponents of those technologies. Like if you're in the business of developing and selling a new electrolysis technology, you need finance. You need lots of finance all the time, and telling a customer that you're likely not to deliver at the megaton level till sometime in the 2040s is not going to get you new finance, right? So we kind of have to work with what we have, like maximizing high quality scrap and sorting it properly and mixing it with the DRI that we have available to make high quality products. Like go down that path of making the highest quality possible steel with the maximum amount of recycled steel. We're gonna, we don't want any more blast furnaces, right? Even with CCS, just because getting the capture rates, as you pointed out, it's just not really that viable. And coal, there's all sorts of reasons not to use coal. It's the fugitives are really hard to handle. Like it's much easier to control your fugitive with natural gas than it is with coal. B, anytime you start gasifying or using coal, there's all sorts of impurities that are in there that's not in natural gas. And the quiet thing is it's just a whole lot easier to do CCS. If you're going to do CCS at all, it's much easier to do it with natural gas than it is with coal. It's a whole jump harder doing it with coal. So I'm not sure we've got, there might be some surprises, and we might see some tailored electrolysis technologies hitting niche markets pretty hard. But I don't see anything that's going to upset this apple cart and really flip the results magic that bullet. You've got here. Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Thanks for this clear, also technical assessment that we will probably stick for the next 2 decades with what we have as the key technologies and need to maximize out of that. And we cannot wait for any magical thing to come up. Margaret, as you're also experienced in international diplomacy, politics, and so on, and this is not a question we eventually prepared for. We heard about the key role eventually of collaboration, international collaboration going on to fully unpack the potential of the sector to really speed up. What would you see as eventually key, let's say, venues or key organizations or key things to happen to speed up this kind of collaborative effort to get the global sector going, aligning, not waiting on each other, not seeing any hurdles by eventually countries not moving so others hold back? What, from your perspective, are potential options to increase the speed and to create this room where this collaboration can happen, from your experience?
Great question. So I think for international collaboration between governments and industry and civil society, that's not a bilateral. I think civil society needs to be a really strong player in those international conversations around collaboration. That particularly where the bottlenecks are identified, I think that's a great place to begin collaboration. Folks like trying to have a common purpose and solve common problems. I think the challenges there will be kind of who could benefit more or less around those bottlenecks. And so kind of where that iron ore is located, who owns what technology. I think that's a great place when we talk about bottlenecks for OECD countries, for wealthy countries, to start thinking of what's the right mix of incentives to bring more people to the table and to incentivize more wider participation in a green iron ore trade or green steel trade. I think also a bit of decentralization. I think right now we've started to see kind of, obviously we talk about OECD and non-OECD. I think kind of a decentralization. So it's great that U.S. and North America generally are talking about something like a climate club with the EU, with Germany. But I think we need to have kind of decentralized kind of focuses of kind of, and what I mean by that is what I would love to see is really strong alliances starting to develop between, say, South Korea and Australia around green iron ore trade. Because I think that's going to really spur Japan into action to realize they can't, they need to get moving fast to get in on that as well. I think when it comes to India, Chris has made this point in one of the blogs that we recently did, and he made this point today, which is, I think particularly for India, there has to be a really diverse set of incentives because they don't have the competitive advantage of access to cheap natural gas right now, which also means that there'll be trouble in terms of potential domestic hydrogen production later. So I think really thinking from a collaborative standpoint of what are the right mix of incentives from US, Australia, Europe, South Korea, Japan, to really incentivize what's needed now to try and lock out more coal in the future and do more zero to low emissions construction pipeline into India so that you really create that business case. And I think that the great foothold there can be companies that are headquartered or have strong presence in OECD, but are also growing and operating in India. So Arcelor Nippon joint venture is a great opportunity. Tata, JSW, these are international global companies with that are traded around the world, but also have really strong families and leadership behind them, as well as kind of a reputation to uphold. So I think those are a few good examples. But yeah, so decentralized kind of collaborations and really working on bottlenecks together. In terms of the fora, I think, there's a few out there, right? The Clean Energy Ministerial, IDDI, a few others around public procurement. I think those are moving along, and those were certainly part of the Glasgow breakthrough as vehicles for change. I think we're going to see even more a part of that. Again, that decentralization of it will be a really strong and necessary trend that we'll need to start seeing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Very much appreciated that you have taken this. Wido, turning back to one of our core lead authors of the whole endeavor. If you look back for the last 2 years and imagine where we started with the discussion and hearing also the discussion here, how would you sum up this development of the sector, of our work, and also about maybe the key challenge or the key breakthroughs that we have seen over the couple of last years in the understanding that has brought us where we are here today? How do you sum up this kind of work piece of the last 2 years?
Yeah, thank you. I'm thinking now, my current feeling is I'm very surprised that basically all in the panel agree that the steel sector transformation could be faster. I wouldn't have expected a uniform opinion on this today, but this is a great message. And I think this really shows also like what happened in the steel industry over the last 2 years. I think one particular point is that when you looked at DRI announcements, up until last year, they were mainly concentrated in Europe. I think this was mainly driven by strong climate policy, the EU Green Deal. But what we witnessed over the last year is really that it's a global effort now. We have DRI announcements basically in all regions of the world. And we're really seeing that the entire steel industry. I think a key point indeed is the final investment decisions. It's important to look at the scoreboard. Where do we need to be by 2030? It's important to understand the bottlenecks, but the one that brings it all together is the final investment decisions, because this one shows whether we have a comprehensive package, whether we dealt with renewable energy, whether we have the infrastructure in place, and whether we have a business case for all these things and the right regulatory framework. And here we see that we're currently still on a comparatively low level. And I think this really needs to be the focus for the next years, to think creatively about these kind of solutions. In a national context, it will require like strong government policies, but most importantly also in an international context, because this is really where the acceleration potential lies if different countries and strengths cooperate together on this issue.
Thanks, Wido. Now let's turn a bit also the head into our audience and questions. We got one from Santiago Enriquez, and I guess asking Andrew eventually to answer it is a good at least first try, but I also would others invite to answer. The question is, should the government put pressure on the steel industry so that it adopts low carbon technologies, or is it better that government enable more technology transfer between public R&D and lead adopters from the industry? What way do you think will be the more effective that we get really the acceleration going?
Yeah, my own view would probably be that, you know, government works best when they can set a trajectory and set up an enabling policy framework without necessarily picking and choosing technology winners. So the governments certainly play an absolutely vital role, and particularly when we looked at some of these, I think you call them bottlenecks. I mean, a lot of those are in the gift of government to try and resolve. A lot of stuff is outside of the industry. I think the industry understands where we holistically need, collectively need to get to from a greenhouse gas perspective. I think companies are, there's variation in maturity between regions, but companies understand where they need to get to. They understand the technical options available to them. I think the key role for government is to put those policy frameworks in place that enable those transitions to happen. And issues like infrastructure, which I found myself talking an awful lot about infrastructure, because I think it's so important, whether it's provision of hydrogen, shipping of hydrogen or ammonia, if you can use CCS, having CCS infrastructure there as well. That stuff really has to happen in the broader ecosystem. And we need that. Governments will play an absolutely critical role in getting that stuff in place. And if that happens, I think that will make it much easier for steelmakers to make their choices.
Any other views on the panel on this question? Steaks and carrots.
I would like to comment that we think that government should develop the policy, industrial policy for solving some of the bottlenecks. For example, I'm giving some example from Brazil. We have a high biomethane potential in Brazil, close to big steel mills in São Paulo State, in the countryside of São Paulo State, in Minas Gerais, Rio de Janeiro. But we didn't have the gas pipelines in these regions. So here we see that we have the potential resource, renewable resource. Only around 3% of our biogas potential is now used and developed. And we see that we have the resource, the energy resource, we have the final potential consumer, but we didn't have the infrastructure to connect these two points. So that's why we think about a holistic policy that encompasses the technical bottlenecks, but also the regulation bottlenecks. Our regulation to insert the biomethane in the natural gas pipelines is recent, so we need to think in a policy that can put all these elements together and create enablers for these issues.
Thanks. So Stefania also indirectly, of course, made the point that infrastructure is key to bring those opportunities together. Turning a bit more also on the demand side of things, happy also to hear Margaret or other thoughts on that. So really making the green iron trade as a thing where people start to invest on both sides of, let's say, the equation. What would be needed is our like offtake agreements, insurances, what we need to really get this going, or is magically, because the demand is big, we have a lot of willingness to pay eventually from downstream sectors, from automotive, for example. Is this market just created on the demand for green, or does regulatory framework specifically also to enhance green iron trade need to step in here?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So I think, first it's to kind of differentiate green steel demand with green iron demand. I think we're starting to kind of see kind of bilateral agreements to kind of cooperate around green iron development and potential import-export. But we haven't yet seen it necessarily a steel maker make a strong bilateral to say, I'm going to be your first off-taker of green iron in a major big way. We've heard kind of these bilateral deals, but it's not specific enough yet to say exactly when and where and how much. And so I think the more specific we can get on those things, the better. On the green steel demand, I think we're seeing signals and MOUs between particularly car companies in Europe and steel companies in Europe. But we have not, we need a bit more transparency, I think, around some of those bilateral deals in terms of procurement. And we have the public-private partnership of the First Movers Coalition in the US, which I think is a good start, but I think we need to raise the bar on that significantly. And the U.S. just needs to kind of put its flag in the ground, as it is off to do. That we need to have our first flagship green steel facility, zero emissions steel facility, and we need to have shovels in the ground really, really, really soon. And we need to have off-taker agreements as a part of that to get it off the ground. And so the things I'm looking for are car companies and companies to do with electrification, so wind or transmission, to be off-takers in those kind of first mover markets, in more and more specifics of deadlines and commitments to deliver on that front. Demand assurances be needed. I think that goes to kind of the structure and transparency of the deal, and what role I think government can play, also as a government procurer, and that there's going to be kind of a phased transition. We want to procure what green steel is available in terms of zero or low emissions that's out there, but we also want to be incentivizing folks for that long-term transition. That we want to be procuring from companies that are committed to decarbonizing their business strategy not just their business product, their products or a facility. Yeah. I think that is the key signal that we're looking for. If a company is not wholly committed to a 1.5 pathway, I'm skeptical of them just putting out any old, frankly, EAF or low emissions recycled with clean electricity. It's a good thing. It's a natural part of the solution set, an important one, but there's no value add necessarily in that. And so I think we're looking for current primary producers, what's coming from there, and incentivizing the full transition and alignment of the business strategy, not just individual products as well.
Well, thanks for this great question, Justin Mikulka. I do not want to take any false credit here for this great question. I would also pass this one to Andrew and say, hey, from your industry perspective, what would be needed to really get the framework going that you could imagine investors taking the steps, developing these kind of pathways? What's your suggestion?
I think we absolutely need a few things to happen. We need first movers to succeed. I think that's so important because we've got a few companies going out there now building hydrogen DRI, the ones who've taken, investment decisions. We need those sites and those facilities to work and to develop DRI and make steel that goes into market. I think that will be terribly, terribly important. But we also need demand, right? We need demand from the market, and we're starting to see some low carbon product and low carbon branding getting its own way into the market now, which is hopefully will start to show that there is a demand for this kind of material. There's also policy developments happening around the world in different regions which are aiming to support and facilitate the transition. But I think the most important thing we can do is make sure that this decade that we're entering into is a decade of action, when we start to move this discussion away from, pathways and roadmaps and models towards, as Margaret said, shovels. We need to see this kit being built. And when it's built, it gives so much confidence to everybody else that this is practical, this is possible, and it's a solution. And I think as engineers, we're very good at that. If we get the conditions right, I think it'll happen. And it would be it's a really exciting time for the industry, I think.
Well, Andrew, perfectly. I take this as the last word because it sums it quite up. And to hear this very optimistic view from the steel industry is something that I couldn't have said better. So thank you to all